I have time, so we'll go ahead and get started. And we sort of hinted last week that we are heading into some of the darker sections, actually of which Samson is a highlight. Uh, that says something if Samson is a high point. Um, so with the story of Jephthah, it begins really at the end of chapter 10, and you have God, it says at the verse 16, so in Judges chapter 10, verse 16, so the people are repenting and they're putting away the gods that they had among them, and they serve the Lord, and God becomes impatient over the misery of Israel. And it's at this point where God is ready to deliver them that he brings actually what would seem to be even worse oppression. And we tend to not see oppression or difficulty as a moment for God's glory to shine, for God to appear glorious in whatever he does. And you'll sort of see the same idea in the New Testament when Paul is talking about the suffering of the believers. And several of the writers in the New Testament, when they talk about suffering, they always speak of it in terms of a chance for God's glory to be perceived. It is a sign of their destruction, is what Paul will say. And so when we find ourselves in difficulty, it doesn't necessarily mean, like Job and his friends seemed to think, that you have done something bad or wicked. Certainly that might be the case. You would know. But it could just be that God is about to do something amazing. And I don't often think of suffering or difficult circumstances in that way. I often think, well, this is wrong, this is bad, I must have done something, very much like Job. But you see here, when God is impatient over misery, God creates a situation in which he will deliver his people and his glory will be seen. And so that gets us then into chapter 11. And in that first section there, we'll look at the first three verses for just a second, and then we'll kind of set the stage for who Jephthah is. And then we'll move into the call of the people for Jephthah to be made their leader, which you can see at the end of chapter 10 is the perfect setup for the story in chapter 11. Whoever fights against the Ammonites, he'll be head over all of Gilead. And then that will move into Jephthah's military campaign and this vow that he makes and the resolution of that later on. So in chapter 11, we'll just read these first three verses. It says, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman. Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him. All right, so the question then is, when we look at Jephthah, the first thing he's just described to us as Jephthah the Gileadite, but also as a mighty warrior. How is he a mighty warrior?
Is that an introductory statement for what's to come, or has he already done something?
It seems to be that at this point, when we're getting into the people saying, hey, come be leader over us, he's already done something to make a name for himself. We could certainly see it as it's true of the whole narrative. Perhaps in some previous battles. That's a very nice way to read this. I love you. Yeah, it's the description at the end. I would prefer the reading where it's maybe some previous military campaign and he was known for great exploits. It seems in the text, and I always prefer the most charitable reading possible, but it seems in the text that it's with this band of worthless fellows. Like he gets this reputation of being a mighty warrior by, I don't know what worthless fellows did necessarily, and I don't have their daily itinerary in the ancient world, but I would suppose that they robbed and pillaged and ransacked and did those sorts of things. Yes? Yes. Yeah, and so it's sort of the idea that you've got people who have a harsh reputation. And to the point that in this narrative, this is what you get. Here's the background information of Jephthah. He doesn't come from good beginnings. His mother, I don't know if anybody's translation says the son of a concubine or the son of a slave woman. Most probably say something like prostitute. But concubine would be an acceptable way to translate this. The word is just woman, the son of a woman. Well, I mean, I don't know many people who aren't sons of women. I mean, so the text means something when it says that. And so most likely what you've got in the ancient world is this odd way that, to me, odd, that people would sort of, tier their family. And if this woman, his mother, was one of Gilead's concubines, one of the things that seems to bear itself out in the text is that the son of a concubine doesn't inherit. And so he is sort of a lesser person in the family. And then when the sons that do inherit are old enough, they're like, you have to leave. Right? And there's sort of, I don't necessarily know that this is what the writer is trying to do. Can you think of anybody else who had two sons, and there's an older one, and then the younger one is born, and the older one gets cast out? Ishmael, yeah, with Abraham and Ishmael. And so I don't know it's similar, at least, and it's interesting. But here you go. This is Jephthah. He does not inherit land, and so he would not properly be considered in the lineage of his father Gilead, but he is called a Gileadite. He is going to be the leader of all the people, so he goes from no inheritance to ruling over everything. He goes from this very humble beginning to being the most prestigious person, right? To having the highest place of exaltation amongst his people. And he goes from being considered a criminal, perhaps, to being exalted and considered highly worthy of honor. That sounds a lot like Jesus. And what would have been thought about Jesus' beginnings, his lineage, the way he is outcast from his people, the way he is considered a criminal and crucified with criminals. And so you sort of see some of these themes showing up with each of the judges. And we see the theme of the deliverer, Jesus, throughout all of these different stories that were being told. And when I say story, just to be clear, I had somebody tell me once that when they hear the word story, they think made up. As somebody, when I was in college and going through all the classes I had in history, we always refer to things as stories. So when I say story, please don't mistake that for something that's not real. I mean something that actually happened. So sometimes I'll use the word narrative, just to be completely clear. Okay, so any other things that you notice about Jephthah? Yeah, so Abimelech hires these same worthless fellows, and that may have been somehow attached. Sure. Mercenaries could be a good understanding. Several people have suggested that really a better title for the book is warlords. And so that would kind of fit in, this idea that he's a warlord. He's got this band of people, to the point where whatever he's doing, when the leadership of the Gileadites, when they find themselves in trouble, they go to Jephthah for help. It would sort of be like if the state of Tennessee got in trouble and the governor called the mob, and we'd be like, hey, we need the National Guard, or the State Guard, or I don't know, what do y'all have? It's National Guard. Yeah, we need the National Guard, but this isn't working out. So can you guys come and sort of take care of our problem? I mean, they'll take care of it, but maybe not the way that you want. And so it's kind of the feel that I get. It's not on the up and up. But you see the story of Abimelech right before and how the people dealt with everything, and it's not good. So the only qualifications we have for Jephthah is that he's loosely related to these people, and he's really good at fighting. And this is how they choose their leaders. So one of the lessons that I draw out of this is we have to be careful how we choose our leaders. Just because somebody is very successful in whatever their worldly occupation is, does not necessarily mean that they are going to be a good spiritual leader. Now, hopefully those two things go hand in hand because they have been employing biblical principles and they have been making good, wise decisions, and hopefully those things go together. But I mean, there are a lot of mobsters who are really successful, and I don't know that we would want any of them, as a shepherd in the church here. And so we have to be, that's a really important lesson. Humans often mistake worldly success for spirituality, and those are not the same thing. Are there any other lessons before we get into the narrative that y'all have drawn out or you notice perhaps? Okay. Into the story. So the Ammonites make war, starting in verse 4, and verse 4 through 11 is where the leaders come to Jephthah, and they're going to say, come and be our leader that we may fight against the Ammonites. And I think in verse 6, when I read that, I was like, well, you can't do this by yourself? And I think it just shows the state of the people, where there is no leader. Jesus would look out on the people of Israel, and he would be distressed because they were like sheep with no shepherd. There is no leader. And it just highlights again and again the necessity of good and godly leadership. In whatever capacity we're talking about, you need somebody who knows how to point the direction that we ought to be going and then take steps in that direction. When I talk to my kids about what a leader is, that's what I tell them. A leader is somebody who knows the way they should go and then is brave enough to take the first step and then ask people to follow them. You don't have to know all the answers. You don't have to be great at everything. You just have to be brave enough to take a step in the right direction. And that's missing, except for Jephthah, apparently. And so in that section there, were there any things that y'all notice or that are interesting to you? Yes, sir. Yeah, it's going to invoke him in sort of a vow. Or this discussion is going to invoke him. Perhaps. Yeah. Why have you turned me away? Did you not hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are distressed? Perhaps.
Kind of an interesting negotiation. The first job they seem to offer him is to be the commander of the troops. And he says, nah. So they kind of up the ante, and he says, now, to make sure I understand here, if I come and do this, you're going to make me the ruler. And so he winds up negotiating a higher standing than what he was initially offered.
Yeah. I don't know. I think you're exactly right. That's what you've got. We might call it contract negotiation. I don't know that they would have worded it that way. But that's what you see. He's like, no, if I'm going to come do this, you're going to make me the ruler. And they agree. And I think it was Jesse last week talked about how you can sort of see the transition into where some of these people who are ruling or acting as judges, perhaps even Abimelech certainly was acting like a judge, but Gideon seems to be not a judge, as a king. Gideon perhaps even acted as a king, and here that's the thing that's being negotiated. If I do this, I'm your king. And they say, okay. And so when we read through this, sometimes we'll talk about with the kids as we do the daily Bible reading, is the first official king of the united kingdom of the people was Saul, but there were kings in Israel before there was King Saul. They're just like regional kings, and that's sort of what you see here.
Gilead was east of the Jordan, right?
I believe so. And perhaps that tells us something about Gideon, that when they come to him and ask for help, he doesn't say no. So, I mean, there's something to that. Yeah, he seems to be a little upset. He brings it up. History seems to be very important to him, his personal history. When he's talking to the Ammonites in a little while, he's going to bring up the history between the two people, two people groups. And so he does bring that up. And it's very interesting that repeatedly throughout the story in Scripture, you're going to see the same thing. People being hated by their brothers and then exalted to high positions. Joseph being hated by his brothers and then being made ruler in Egypt. Jesus and his brothers. In John chapter 7, Jesus' brothers are trying to get him killed. Why don't you go up to Jerusalem? They know that the people in Jerusalem are seeking to put him to death, and they're sort of trying to goad him into going. And we have a letter written by one of his brothers in the New Testament. And so there's this family tension that runs throughout the narrative in Scripture, and you see that here. Especially if these elders happen to be his brothers who kicked him out previously, and now he's coming to them and saying, okay, but I'm going to be your king. Any other thoughts? We finally get God in our story here. There's this vow that they make. If you bring me home and fight against the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, then I will be your head. And so it's refreshing to see somebody giving God credit for things. God is going to be the one who gets this victory. He will give me the Ammonites into my hand. And when he does that, I'm your king. And the Gileadites, like Dawn mentioned, yes, that's exactly right. The Lord will be a witness between us if we do not do as we have said. And so Jephthah goes in verse 11. He meets with the elders, or he goes with the elders, and the people make him leader over them. And then we get into the rest of the narrative. So this is our introduction, where the people are finally, and it's interesting that it's Jephthah who brings it up. And at this point, we have to ask, especially when we're about to get into vows in a little while, it's unclear how much of the law these people know. We read later that when they find the book of the law, that they haven't been keeping the Passover, and it will say a Passover like this was not kept since the time of the judges. Well, that's kind of a big deal, the Passover. And so there's this question of how much do
How much do they know, and how much does this going over the, okay, I feel famous now. I don't know the answer to that question. Right? It's not an answerable question. But when we get into things like Jephthah's vow, very likely he did not give the law sitting at home, that he could go consult for all the intricacies of the laws about vows. And so we have to kind of keep that in mind, that we're not dealing with a society that is necessarily very literate of the law that is supposed to give them guidance. But he knows enough to know that God is the one who raises up and tears down, and that God is the one who will either give these people into his hand or not. So he knows enough to know charge, which is refreshing. Yes. Yes.
Yes. At the very least, we have this oral tradition. Regardless of whether or not he's ever read the text of the Old Testament, he knows who he is. He knows he knows why his God is important. He knows his identity. And that matters. We have to know the same thing. We have an identity as God's people. And it's really important that we recognize that so much of what we do and why we do it is based off of that identity as God's people and what God has done for us as our deliverer. So I think it's kind of a good segue then into the part where he's actually going to bring this up. So he's going to send a message to the leader of the Ammonites, and it's nice to see that somebody is trying to find peace first Blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called the sons of God. Here he is, seeking to avoid conflict. It should always be the first thing we do. If I can avoid getting into an argument with you, I would much rather do that. And so he sends a messenger. He said, why are you here? Why are you fighting in this land? I think that's a really good question to ask. If somebody's being mean to you, I don't often think to ask, why are you doing this? Maybe they don't even know. So he asks that question, and he gets the answer, because you stole our land. Well, now I understand why you feel that way. But then he's going to go through, and he's going to recount the history of their people, about how when they came up out of Egypt, they did not take the land away from Moab or the Ammonites, but they went through the wilderness to the Red Sea, and they came to Kadesh, and then they were going to send messengers to Edom, but the king wouldn't let them go through, and so they're going to send messengers to the king of Moab, but he wouldn't consent, and so they're going to stay in Kadesh. Then they're going to journey through the wilderness and go around Edom and the land of Moab, and they're going to come on the east side, and then they're not going to enter into the Moabite territory, but they're going to send messengers to the Amorites. And, hey, please let us pass through. And if I remember right, back when Moses is asking, he even says, we'll bring our own water. Right, we don't want any of your stuff. We just need to get through to where we're going. And the response from the Amorites, is to come out and attack them. So they have this fight that's going to go on. And then when he's speaking to these people, he's going to ask them, you live in the land that your God has given you, and we will live in the land that our God has given us. And if your God wanted you to have the land, why didn't he give it to you in the past 300 years? Why are you taking it upon yourself now to disobey the boundaries or the allotments that the Lord has set? And so he's going to, in verse 27, he's going to sort of sum this up. I have not sinned against you, and you do wrong by making war on me. The Lord, the judge, will decide this day between the people of Israel and the people of Ammon. And now I don't know if that sounds natural to us. We typically don't think of things that way. But again, in Jephthah's mind, God will be the one who delivers the people, or God will be the one who punishes the people. And so he sees this, and really the entire ancient world would have seen this as the judgments of the divinities. Here they are, when Israel goes to war, it's really Yahweh and Kamash going to war. And whoever wins is the stronger God. And that sort of helps maybe set the scene for, if your God was stronger, why didn't he give you the land already? Does that make sense? Anything else that you notice of importance in that? Yes, hopefully he had a good memory. What's interesting is, as far as we can tell, Ammon doesn't dispute this. Right? They're like, yeah, you're right. But we're not leaving. And so Jephthah's telling the truth. And so it sort of seems like everything that we can tell, very bad beginnings, but throughout this section, he seems to be a person of his word. He's very careful in the things that he's saying. He's making sure that the agreement is right. I'm going to be the king. He is the one who looks to God. When he is dealing, this foreign diplomacy, he looks to the story of the people of Israel. He sees that God is going to be the one who decides this. And so as we read this, all of a sudden, Jephthah is starting to look a lot better. And I believe, it's not ever stated in the text, I believe that this is one of the reasons why he shows up in Hebrews 11. I don't think it's the reason, but it's one of the reasons. He is putting his trust in God, and he is doing what he said. And he is trying as best as he can to avoid conflict, which is admirable.
Kind of reminds me of Gamaliel's argument about dealing with apostles.
Yes. Yeah, it's very much like Gamaliel's argument. If this is from God, you shouldn't fight it. And if it's not from God, it will fail on its own. It's very similar. Any other comments? That will take up about 20 minutes. I have to admit, this is one of my least favorite. parts of the Bible. But in verse 29, here we get the judge pattern, right? So the Spirit of the Lord is upon Jephthah. So now we know that God has also chosen Jephthah to act in this capacity. And he begins passing through all of these places. And as he begins on this journey, he does something that is actually a really good thing. He's going to make a vow of offering to the Lord. But here he's not careful. If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. I don't know how to read that any differently than it's written. Your translation might have some minor word variants, but whatever comes out of his house. Some translations will actually say, whatever comes out of my house shall be the Lord's, and I will offer them up for a burnt offering. I think that's reading things into the text. It's general. Whatever comes out, I'm going to offer. More than likely, what does he expect? Perhaps a slave, some animal. Yeah, so the question is, what is this guy thinking? If we're going to, we'll just look at a couple different scenarios to help us try to get into the mindset of these people. Human sacrifice is common in the land, right? You have the various idols, Moloch being one, where people will offer their children. It's a regular occurrence. Human sacrifice is not something that was unknown to these people. It may have creeped in. That's probably part of the complaint with the idols. Get rid of these idols, get rid of these gods. It's not acceptable. In the law, God has said, I will never ask for your sons or your daughters, because he's going to provide his own. We do have to be careful, I think, from going too far, because the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross is a human sacrifice, but it is the only one that the Father ever called for, with the exception of Isaac, and he intercedes. And so while he's looking at the cultures around him, and he sees, very likely, multitudes of these types of sacrifices, so it is possible that when he says this, he is thinking about some person, a servant, a slave, something like that. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to fathom that this would be a vow that somebody would make. But it gets worse. I mean, just wait. And so the Septuagint is the text that I'm more familiar with, just because I don't speak Hebrew. But Tim is right. The Septuagint says, I will offer him, having in mind a human sacrifice. And the Hebrew phraseology seems to indicate the same thing. And if anything here, we could say that this is a very tragic instance of people being so affected by their culture that they don't know their right from their left. Very much like in Genesis 19, where Lot has been with the people in the cities of the plain for such a long period of time that when people are beating down the door to his house, instead of saying, stop, don't do this, go away, he says, here, take my daughter. Not okay. Right? And so that also is an instance of somebody being so affected that they don't know their right from their left. And so this is setting the scene.
He also doesn't understand the power of God. This is a useless vow. God's already come on in power.
That's a good point.
And he doesn't need to bargain with God
that's a good point. Um, this indicates that he doesn't understand the power of God or how God operates, because the Spirit of the Lord has already come upon Jephthah. He's going to win. But there seems to be this bargaining where it's unnecessary. And the same is absolutely true for us. Right? The Son of God has come in the flesh, has been crucified and buried and raised from the dead. And if we are united with him, then we will be saved. We don't have to bargain with God to get that salvation. We will be with the Lord forever. And I think that's a really good point.
Back in verse 24, when it says, "Will you not possess whatever Chemish or God gives you to possess?" Is that a statement of appeasement to them, or is that sort of a recognition that their God is being real?
That's a good question. So back in verse 24, will you not possess what your God, Kamash, has given you, or Chamash has given you to possess? Is that just sort of like appeasing them, or is that a recognition that this is an actual God? I would assume, right? The charitable reading would be it's an appeasing statement. So that's always what I prefer. More than likely, though, it is probably a recognition that these gods are real and that they go to war with one another. That's very common. If you're interested in learning ancient Near Eastern languages, there are dots and marks and triangles and all sorts of fun shapes. But if you ever wanted to read them, that is the way that they understand these things.
That view would make thou more understandable.
Yes, that view that this is a real God makes Jephthah's vow more understandable. He does not have everything that we have. He is, to borrow Paul's phrase, he is groping in the darkness, looking, striving towards God, and doing what he knows. And it's not good.
We talk about this all the time, but I think sometimes we just kind of think about the Israelites as they only know God, they only worship God, but it's like their whole time coming out of Egypt, I mean, they've just constantly been around idolatry. So I think that's probably the more likely scenario. We just kind of don't think that way a lot, probably.
Yeah, I think you're right. Was there? Yeah.
Do you not think we do that as well? God, if you get me through this, I will do something usually that you're never going to do. But we make rash vows when we think that's our way of getting God to do something rather than just asking him for what we need. God, if you'll do this, I'll give up this, or I will give a third of my wealth. Or we make these insane vows when we're under pressure.
Yeah, we do the same thing. I think you're exactly right. And what you said is absolutely key. If we will just go to God in prayer, it may not turn out where life is easy or fun, but we've already won, right? We already have the victory. And if I'm bargaining with God, if I ever sit down and pray to him, Lord, if you get me through today, then I'll give these things up. Why don't I just give those things up then? I mean, if I know I shouldn't be doing it, just give it up now. And it comes back to what was said earlier, that sometimes we forget who we're dealing with when we are talking about God. The Spirit of the Lord is already on Jephthah. Of course, we have the benefit of hindsight and having the text preserved for us. He's already won. This is decided.
Leviticus 27 seems to give him an out too. If they've been familiar with the law, if you made a vow with the person, you could redeem that person for a certain amount of money. In fact, it specifies females. Valuation should be 30 shekels. So I think, unless I'm misunderstanding what that is saying, is that he could, if he'd been familiar with the law, he had an out.
Yep.
But he obviously did not know that.
Yes. And that's a really important point, because the language in the text would be different had he known that. And so even here, right, God, that's one of the wonderful things about the law. is God knows our weaknesses. He knows we fail. He knows we're not always as smart as we should be, and he knows we don't always think things through. So you have that sort of safety catch. If you make a rash vow and it's concerning a person, here's how you fix that. And so had he known this, he could have fixed it. So in my mind, reading through it a long time, I tried to get out of having to deal with the passage by saying, Leviticus 27. I'm not sure that he knew it. And there's nothing in the text to indicate that he does. But this is not God. It's very important for me to realize that this is not God condoning his actions. This is somebody who doesn't understand and doesn't know what they're doing the best they can.
I think this is a pointed, and Jay said this, so I guess I'm just saying it again. Shouldn't be doing that. But it's a very pointed lesson to us about just how far down the whole structure of their religious faith had come.
Yeah.
We have no indication that there are priests involved. We have no indication that there are regular sacrifices going on, and obviously they're not teaching the law.
Right.
So I think it's important for us to remember that that is where they are, and part of the reason that God is seeing the path they are on as so dangerous.
Yes. And it is an encouragement to teach the children from the time they are young the way they should go. To teach anybody we have an opportunity to teach. Because when you're in the dark, having come out of the dark, you really don't know your right from your left. You don't know what is right and what is wrong. You're basing every decision that you make off of cultural standards. And Jesus calls Satan the ruler of this world, which means that when I'm in the darkness and I'm making my decisions based off of cultural standards, I'm using the standard that the ruler of this world has set. And so we have to teach. Is that absolutely, Don mentioned in the law, here's the place, right? Here's where you would go, and here is the provision that makes this whole thing unnecessary. But they don't know. All right, I think I've tried to avoid it long enough. So Jephthah goes and fights, and in verse 33, the Ammonites are subdued before the people of Israel. And when he comes home, I do the same thing at home. I can't. When he comes home, his daughter comes out to meet him with tambourines and dances. His only child. Besides her, he didn't have a son or daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble for me, for I opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow." And she said to him, "My father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites." And so she said to her father, "Let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions." And so he says, "Go." And then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, and she and her companions, and they wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and so it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. I don't know how to read that a different way. When you go back and look at the vow, whether you're looking in the Hebrew or in the Greek, it seems to indicate that he thought it was going to be some kind of person. And then when you read through the text, his daughter comes out. She's made trouble for him. And it's important first to note that it's a daughter, not a son. Not because of the gender difference, but because if he was worried about his inheritance or his family name or any of those things, the daughter goes and joins whoever she marries. She becomes part of their family, and she raises up children for that other family. Not that you never have any relation again, but he's not concerned about his lineage. He seems to be concerned that it's his daughter. And when the text says he did to her as he had vowed, I have tried. How long have I been a Christian? Almost 20 years? I have tried for almost 20 years to read it a different way. And I don't know that you can. Yeah.
I've always thought my whole life it was a lot like Hannah who gave Samuel to the Lord. She asked if she could have a son, she dedicated to God. And I've always been taught and looked at, but judging by your reaction, he probably kept with the Canaanite rules that he was used to and probably had her killed.
He probably did.
You know, there is a part of this that really makes me respect Jephthah, and that is he honored that vow.
Yeah.
You know, maybe he didn't understand fully the law, and probably he didn't, but he honored God enough to understand that he had made a vow. You know, in the New Testament, we hear Jesus say, whoever does not, hate father and mother cannot come to me. And Jesus says, I came to bring a sword. And so it's an interesting thing here that, Jephthah really displays this devotion to God, even if it's only just for this one moment, that I think we can learn a valuable lesson from. As tragic as it is, a lot of us would just say, well, no way I'm fulfilling that. He didn't do that.
No, you're right.
And he honored God first. And, I don't know. I don't read it any other way than that. Maybe there's another way to read it. But anyway, I thought at least that might be some little silver lining here.
Yeah, no, that is the redeeming element of the story. And regardless of what happened to her, let's just assume the worst. I think she's safe, right? She knew who God was. She apparently had the same faith. She didn't run away. He lets her go off for a while with her friends, and she comes back, right? And so regardless of how you look at this, there is amazing faith that these people have. And
We have to be careful what kind of vows we make.
absolutely, we have to be careful what kind of vows we make.
You know, in our family, a promise was a promise. Well, a promise is just a kind of vow that you end up breaking anyway. But be careful what kind of vows you make and make sure that they're serious when you speak.
Yes. Bob?
In understanding that vow that he made, for 2 months he was probably, I would think, tormented by what was eventually going to happen to Adam.
Yeah. And neither one of them, like Dan mentioned, try to break it, right? They don't try to get out of it. And so I think all those things that you see, we can look at the story and it's tragic. But the overriding theme in this is the faith of at least Jephthah and his daughter. In this element, Jephthah has the faith to go and do what nobody else is doing. He trusts that God is going to give the victory. He carries out vow. And his words, I have opened my mouth to the Lord. I cannot take back the vow. I guarantee you I'd be looking for excuses. But that's not what he does.
He's also mentioned in the Hall of Fame.
He is, yeah, in Hebrews 11.
So even this incident somehow didn't take away from his relationship with God. And somehow God didn't hold this against him. Otherwise, I don't know how. It's the same way we look at Samson. How did Samson get in there? Well, if Samson got in there, how did Jephthah get in there? I don't.
Yeah. Most of the judges, when they get mentioned in Hebrews 11, you're like, I don't know how they got there. But that is powerful because God isn't judging things the way that we do, and he doesn't look at things the way that we do. To God, it's their faith that matters. And when I look at this, and you'll hear people, they'll kind of hem and haw about little things that God asks us to do, like baptism. If somebody wants to serve God, and here is Jesus saying, look, get baptized. and we want to try and find ways out of that, and we want to get around that. Look at this and the faith of this man who says, I have opened my mouth, I'm not taking it back. And if that was the attitude that I had towards the things that God had said and toward the things that I have promised, becoming one of God's children, the things that I have promised to God, I think I would find myself trying to hem and haw about things much less often. And so this is a very powerful example of faith, both Jephthah and the daughter.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I failed to mention the faith of his daughter in my comment. And wow, I mean, how many of our, I mean, to me, that displays possibly greater faith than Jephthah had
Yeah.
on her part, because she said, "You made the vow, okay, let it be done."
It's the same faith of Jesus in the garden. This is the Father's plan. We're going through with it. And in that way, I think we can draw out the lesson. All right, we're out of time. Thank you for bearing with me this evening. We'll begin chapter 12 next week.